3 years ago, I concluded a very impactful academic research study where I answered the question, how did Cowessess First Nation develop and implement its Miyopema-Tiswin Act to retake control over its children? I found that years after the implementation of the Act, not a single Cowessess child was apprehended and placed into government child welfare. I had the opportunity to disseminate my research to thousands of people all over Canada and beyond. Amazing research is being conducted by racialized faculty and graduate students all over Canada in fields from biology to psychology, from public policy to public health, from research in film to research in education. Racialized researchers are doing amazing work to solve real-life problems. And now they're here to share it with you in very simple terms. My name is Kwaku Ayisi, and this is Academic Research Made Simple. Hello, welcome to the Academic Research Made Simple podcast, or ARMS. My name is Kwaku Ayisi. I am a PhD candidate at the Johnson Shoyama Graduate School of Public Policy here at the University of Regina. Amazing research is being conducted by racialized graduate students and racialized faculty all over Canada, from British Columbia all the way to Nova Scotia. And today we have an incredible researcher, Max Adjei-Dadson, to share her research with us. Max has a bachelor's degree in film from California Baptist University and is currently a graduate student at the University of Regina, completing her master's on post-independence Ghanaian film of the 1950s to 1980s. While her research focuses on this topic, her interests vary from sibling dynamics in everyday life versus pop culture to the emotional benefits of pets and the codependent relationships formed therein. She's a non-mysterious Scorpio and an avid critic of media she enjoys, making movie nights a veritable chore for her friends and family. Welcome to the ARMS podcast, Max.
Thank you.
Good to have you. Can you tell us a bit about your journey to becoming a master's student at the Department of Media, Arts, and Performance?
Yeah, absolutely. So as you mentioned in my bio, I have a bachelor's from California Baptist University in film, but I didn't actually start out in that field. I began as a psychology student. So I went through 2 semesters going through the basic classes, and then I kind of realized that that wasn't what I was interested in at all. So a friend of mine asked me to help out on a film set that he was working on for a class, and I absolutely fell in love with it. So I changed my major instantly. I actually kept it a secret from my family for like 2 or 3 more semesters, but I went through the whole process, fell in love with filmmaking and storytelling and everything, and eventually it became my passion. But then I realized that I was more suited to like thinking and talking and writing about film rather than actually making it. I mean, I love being on set, but I really get to shine when I'm like working on the more analytical side of things, the more critical area. So I started to pivot more into writing and research and that sort of thing. And after I graduated, I moved back home to Ghana for 2 years, and slowly started thinking of where I wanted to go in the future, what I wanted to do, how I wanted to move forward. And really the kicker came when I wrote a pilot script that I wanted to pitch to a TV network. And as I was getting feedback from my network, someone told me that the script I'd written was too Western. And I started to think, because the story was about Ghanaian people. It was about Ghanaian people living in their everyday lives in Ghana. And I wondered, what exactly was it that made it too Western? So then I started to think about, what the tenets of Ghanaian cinema and Ghanaian media really are, and how to better incorporate that into my own writing. And as timing would have it, my little sister was looking into going to university, getting her undergrad, and she was looking at universities in Canada. And I thought, this is a sign for me to, look into doing the same thing. So I started looking into programs. I ended up looking at the University of Regina, and the Media, Art, and Performance department was something that I found really robust. The research being conducted was really, really fascinating. So I applied, and here I am.
That's awesome. I find that very interesting because I also did watch a lot of Ghanaian film and cinema growing up. And I'm curious, did they ever explain what exactly made your initial script too Western or?
Well, see, that's what I've been trying to figure out this entire time, you know. So, this might be jumping the gun a little bit, but I'm approaching it sort of from the reverse opposite end. So instead of thinking of what makes it too Western, I want to think of what would make it more Ghanaian.
Oh, okay. Okay. Nice. Can you tell us a bit about the field of MAP, Media Arts and Performance, for those who are not very familiar, and maybe also some of the other research being conducted within this field, either within the U of R or elsewhere?
Yeah. So MAP is really, to me, all about creativity. And the intersection of creativity with academic research and how that can be incorporated into our everyday lives. So a lot of my contemporaries in research here are doing really interesting, fascinating things. They're looking into history, they're looking into modern, contemporary, really underappreciated fields, you know, really things that people don't think about too often. One particular project that's pretty interesting and pretty significant is I have a colleague who's working on research about, I believe, Ukrainian immigrants in Saskatchewan and the way their lives have like grown and changed and differed as time has gone on. And it's just really fascinating. It's a whole facet of history that you wouldn't think connects to the realm of media. But media is really how we can represent and perceive the things that we experience in everyday life. So I think it's just been a really incredible experience to be part of this department where we're taking what's important and distilling it into art, into something that makes it enjoyable, but also something that makes people think more deeply on their lives and the lives of others, on different fields and elements of a life that they wouldn't really be thinking about otherwise.
Okay, interesting. So is there a particular background, like you said, you initially started in psychology and then you transitioned. So would you say that irrespective of your background doesn't really matter? Or is there a particular skill set or points of view that usually might make a student successful in MAP, or it doesn't really matter?
I honestly don't think it matters. I think anyone can get to this point from any kind of background. Like I said, I started in psychology. I have colleagues who have engineering backgrounds, people who work in museum curation, people who have film backgrounds, people from journalism. It's very wide and varied. And just anyone with an interest and a passion and a desire to conduct this research, to take on these projects, is able to do so.
Okay. Now, your research topic specifically, what is your research topic, first of all, and then how would you frame it to a broader audience who might not understand the technicalities of what it might be? It might be simple, but what is your research topic?
Yeah, so my research is focused on a specific group of films that came out of Ghana immediately after we gained independence in the late 1950s. So I'm looking at those films and determining whether there is a specific Ghanaian style of filmmaking that can be distilled from them that came out of the post-independence period and that has influenced Ghanaian filmmaking over the ages and that can possibly be applied to Ghanaian filmmaking going forward. So I think it's pretty simple and pretty straightforward, but in simple terms, I'm really just thinking, is there a style of Ghanaian filmmaking that is specific to Ghana, specific to Ghanaian tradition and conventions, and how do we distill that to, its minute parts? How do we emulate that going forward?
Okay, interesting. And what made you decide to focus on this specific topic?
Yeah, so as I said before, I wrote that script that got reviewed as too Western, and I started looking into Ghanaian filmmaking, and I realized that a lot of the research out there is either about films that are coming out now of the new canon of Ghanaian filmmakers, or things that started really in the 90s. We have a very popular film genre and style, I'm sure you're aware of it, that have like very specific conventions, but they differ pretty dramatically from what was originally being made in Ghana. And yet there is really very, very little research out there on those original Ghanaian films. So really, I was fascinated because it seemed like there wasn't really an interest, which I thought couldn't be, that couldn't be true. We're constantly fascinated by our history and how we kind of came to be. And I'm really interested in how the Ghanaian film industry came to be, how we really got to where we are today. So really, the fact that there is so little research done on that on these films of the specific time period was really what spurred my interest in it.
Okay. Okay, so in regards to that, would you say that the main issue or the main problem that you've identified that you're trying to get more information on and ultimately provide recommendations to could be described as that there isn't a clear style, or it hasn't been discovered in terms of whether there's a clear style of Ghanaian filmmaking? Is that how you describe your problem statement or issue, or how would you put it?
It's definitely the latter, where there just hasn't been any kind of research, anyone like looking into it, anyone working to define it. There definitely is a clear style. I've found very specific patterns throughout my research. But those patterns aren't being recognized or acknowledged. It's something that I feel like is very, it's not a unique problem to Ghana. I've noticed a lot of African countries tend to have the same issue, where a lot of their cultural heritage is really kind of lost, and there isn't as much care put into recovering and rediscovering them as there should be. So really, that's the main issue that I really wanted to address, that there just isn't as much insight into this as there should be. Okay.
Is there a lot of information in literature that speaks to maybe style of filmmaking, maybe not even in Ghana specifically, but in other African countries, and how that was determined? Like, what is the literature saying on in terms of context and in terms of your specific research question?
Yeah. So that has also been one of my problems. Like I said, the literature is just really not out there. There is quite a lot of more broad research that has been very helpful in kind of leading me to where I need to get to. But really, it's especially frustrating because, Africa's a big continent. It's very diverse. One tradition in one country probably isn't the same as, the next country over. So while there's been a lot of research that's been done on filmmakers from other part of Africa that have been, really helpful in informing my own research, it's not something I can easily just apply to Ghana as well. We have our own unique traditions, and being able to kind of wrangle that is it's a little difficult to do when the research is kind of focused on other, the existing research is focused on other places and other people. So, yeah.
Okay. Interesting. And what are your research questions that you're trying to answer with your thesis currently? Yeah,
so there are really three specific ones. The very big one, the main one, is there a Ghanaian style of filmmaking that is endemic to Ghana and Ghanaian traditions? And out of that, what are the elements that define the style? And then finally, that on a more broader scale, how has this style evolved, and how is it still visible in modern Ghanaian cinema? Okay. So yeah, those are really the main questions. And I focus specifically on style rather than content. A lot of film analysis very very importantly, focuses on the stories being told and what they're saying. And that's also very important, obviously, but I think it's also important to acknowledge cinema as a technical art form. So I'm focusing on the technical elements that create that style rather than the stories within them.
Okay, can you give some examples of the technical elements or what you mean by style?
Sure. Yeah. So mostly I'm focused on the camera and how the camera gets involved in the art of storytelling in films. So instead of, say, focusing on the plot and the characters and their arcs, I'm focusing instead on how they're framed in a shot, how they are positioned on screen, the way they move, the way they interact with the props and the set around them, just focusing on those little non-story elements of the film, the things that you really want your audience to forget about when you're making a film, but which can also really inform what exactly you're trying to put out there.
Interesting. Let's talk a bit about your methodology or how you've been going about or intend to go about answering your research questions. Are you, is it through interviews or like how are you collecting information to answer your research questions?
Yeah, so I approached it almost I mean, I'm not really a scientific person, but I like to say I approach it with like the scientific method where I formed my hypothesis there is a Ghanaian style to be found in these elements. And then I observed the specific films that I'm researching from that specific time period, the specific filmmakers under my purview, I guess. And then I went through each of the films very critically. I used different methods. I tried to focus on different elements at a time. So I went through watching each film normally, taking notes, making observations. And then I went through a second time with no sound, just kind of watching the film as it appeared just visually, trying to see what kind of elements jump out at me then when I'm not distracted by the story. Not that the story is a distraction, but in that, like, where it's not the main focus, Then I tried to go through it just audio-wise, just listening to it and hearing what sound elements, what specific language uses, kind of, and create a certain mood, a certain tone, and how that all informs the film. So it's very undefined, I would say, but it's a method that's worked really well for me. So
Okay, the films that you're looking at and dissecting, are they from a specific period of time or?
Yes, they are. So they're all, the earliest film I have is from, I believe, 1950. And the latest I have is from 1989. So they're just a specific time period. So before the 1950s, Ghana didn't have independence. So most films were through the British colonial empire. They were mostly propaganda. And then after the 1980s, we had a boom in a specific style of filmmaking, the video film, that's basically become our trademark. So that sweet spot, the 50s to the 80s, is really where everything was more experimental, everything was new. So I'm focusing on those specific areas.
Okay. So the film from the 1990s forward, would you say like there's a significant difference? And that's why you're not really, like, is there what would you say would be some of that differences?
Yeah, so really what differentiates them is that, they're called video films because at the time that the 90s came around, video cameras were more easily accessible. So the films being made then are simpler, they're cheaper, they're quicker, they're more mass market, consumerist products, where they still tell important stories, obviously, but it's kind of the idea of, like, it's almost like how, everyone has a phone now. Everyone has a camera on their phone. Everyone can go out, make a quick video, post it online. It gets views. great. You know, everyone's a content producer now. This was basically the content producer era of that time. Films were cheaper and easier to produce, so all sorts of ideas were being thrown out there. They were quick to make, quick to sell. There was a lot of like easy returns. So the content basically got less and less dense. It was mostly quick, easy to digest, fantastical stories that people would watch, have a good time, recommend to their friends. There could be like multiple sequels to keep capitalizing on whatever they had made. It's just that, again, I want to reiterate, I don't think these films are any less important. They're a very significant part of our culture and our film language. It's just that I find that their intent and their purpose and their execution is completely, vastly different from the time when, it was a bit more of a difficult process to create films. So filmmakers had to be more intentional in what they were doing and how they were doing it, and what sort of stories they wanted to tell. They had to be very precise, and it's just, there's a very, very big difference.
Okay. How far are you in your research?
I'm actually almost done. I've been working on writing my thesis, so now I'm in the refining process, just kind of streamlining, making sure that my thoughts all flow properly from one step to another, that there's adequate evidence for my findings. So it's a very exciting but very stressful time. It's kind of bittersweet to feel that I'm almost at the end, but it's also kind of rewarding to, I have the sense of accomplishment. I set out to do this, and I've done it. I've very nearly finished doing it. So
that's great. You did mention before about noticing some patterns, which or part of your findings, I'm guessing. Can you talk a bit more about what you found so far?
Yeah, so the biggest one probably is that Ghanaian filmmaking is a lot similar to Ghanaian oral storytelling traditions. Every culture in this world has an oral storytelling tradition, but one thing that I love about Ghana's is that we have a communal kind of style of storytelling. It's very much like, we all kind of know, these stories are passed down to us from generation to generation. So when it comes time to get together and learn from each other, everyone kind of knows it. So everyone's contributing a little bit of everything, right? And these are very much, the style is very much reflected in the films, which is fascinating because it's not something you think of as a collaborative process. So when you think of the general idea of filmmaking is that the camera is a voyeur, an uninvited viewer, so you as the audience seeing through the camera are basically like a peeping Tom, you're looking in on something that you weren't invited to. But in these films, it's almost the opposite. They're telling these stories that are familiar, that Ghanaian people can kind of relate to, They're using the camera in certain ways that doesn't exclude the audience, but almost invites them to be a part of the scenes that they're watching. There's a particular shot that I talked about in my thesis that it was very striking to me, but it's one in which the camera never turns its back on the audience. Actually, that's not the right way to put it, but it's more like the subjects on screen never turn their back to the camera.
Right.
So the audience never feels that they've been cut off from the scene. They're always walking towards the camera. They're always kind of walking alongside with the camera. There are even some shots from no one's point of view, but it feels like people who are within the scene itself. So in that way, the camera and the audience is a part of the story. You're welcome. You're invited into it. It's very communal. It's very open and very inviting, which is almost antithetical to filmmaking. We think of the camera as, the fourth wall, a barrier between what's on screen and who's watching what's on screen. But it's completely different here.
Wow. You make film analysis sound more interesting. Right, because
I think it's pretty interesting. So.
Yeah, it is. A lot of us have watched so many films, so we might analyze it from different points of view. But even what you said about turning the volume off and just watching what happens without the volume is a deeper layer of analysis, which I find very, very fascinating. Have you had any limitations so far within your research study?
Yeah, the limitations, it's something we've talked about already, but it's definitely the lack of pre-existing research into this field. So there's a lot of like second guessing myself where like, there isn't really anyone else who has anything to support what my theories or my findings or anything. So there's this sort of uncertainty that like, what if this is all just, basically something I've made up in my mind. But that's been a bit difficult. It's also, I had a hard time kind of finding sort of like good, copies of the films that I wanted to research. That's also something conservation efforts of African film have been ramping up recently, which is really good. There are these incredible projects going on in Ghana. There's the Africa Film Society, which is something that I'm a huge fan of. They make it their mission to share like classics, to preserve them, to display them, to get people more involved and interested in the history and tradition of African filmmaking. So that's been really helpful. They are actually really instrumental in helping me find one of the films that I needed. So yeah, that's the main, that was the main difficulty, was finding the actual material, the films. They're just not very well preserved. And also the research that, the non-existent research where I basically didn't have a basis to grow my ideas off of. So, yeah.
Okay. So if someone were to ask you why you're doing what you're doing, why you're researching what you are and why it matters, or what will be some of the implications or next steps, or what your research can be used for in terms of adding value. How would you describe that in terms of why it matters and the value that your research would be bringing to film industry, individual filmmakers, or whoever?
Yeah, I think it's really important, first of all, to know where we came from. Nothing exists in a vacuum. The Ghanaian film industry as it stands today didn't come out of nothing. And I think kind of letting ourselves forget that history or not even fully understand it is doing ourselves a huge disservice. It's kind of spitting in the face of the ancestors who worked to build this whole industry that we all love so dearly. So I think it's really important to take a closer look at that history and to learn from it and to understand it. I think it's also important to see what was happening back then, to find what was important, and to see how those important lessons can kind of apply to our lives today. Again, it all comes back to not forgetting our history, to learning from the past, learning the good and the bad, and incorporating what we can, and growing and changing what needs to be changed. So really, I just mostly think it's deeply, deeply important to really understand where we came from.
Wonderful. Okay. Now let's switch gears a little bit. As a racialized researcher and student, are there any barriers? Now you can answer this either on a personal level or in general terms based on maybe what you've seen or heard, but are there any barriers or obstacles to success, and on the other hand, opportunities to success as a result of being a racialized researcher and student that you can speak about?
I would say that I've been very lucky in that regard. I grew up in Ghana where, the concept of like race being a barrier to anything isn't really, it's not as a factor really as it is in places like Canada or in the US. But I've been lucky to be in institutions that value diversity and do take care to prop up diverse voices and experiences. So I have had opportunities that I have had to work for, but there haven't been any barriers put in place by those institutions that I've been at. So I know that this is a unique, extremely lucky situation, and I'm glad that that's something I've been able to experience, and I hope that that's something that others can continue to experience too. Having having unique, different voices is just really important in creating like a more understanding, more interesting world, really. So I'm glad that I've been able to share mine, and I hope that that continues and that is expanded to other people who also don't have that opportunity.
Okay. Let's talk a bit about open research. So the government of Canada is committed to making federally funded science research open by helping to generate research ideas, making data and publications readily available, and making research understandable and useful. So basically, what the government of Canada fund for research, for scientific research, they ask for those findings to be made publicly open rather than having a paywall that serves as a barrier for some people to access. I'm just curious. Other examples include having an open peer review process. As it is, peer review processes, for the most part, the last time I checked, were blind, where if you're sending an article to be published, you don't know who is looking at it. So that's another area that they're talking or advocating for more openness, but not just openness, but accessibility, particularly for groups that have historically lacked access to published research. And so have you heard much about open research, and what are your thoughts, if you have any?
Well, I think it's a really wonderful initiative. I think the world of academia and research is naturally very insular. You know, these were institutions that historically began to kind of prop up the elite of society. So that's something that has continued in the legacy, even as things have tried to change and grow from that history. So really just like working to make research more accessible to, I guess, the public, to people who historically wouldn't have much access to it is a really wonderful thing to kind of break that elitism, to kind of help go past those barriers that, again, prevent growth and development. So yeah, I think it's a really wonderful initiative.
Okay. Let's get back to your research. After answering the research questions that you set out to answer, assuming another researcher wanted to continue, or even if you wanted to continue as an extension of what you've already done, are there any such opportunities that, and maybe another grad student can pick up from where you left off and look at the question from maybe from a different viewpoint, or look at it from the point of view of maybe different time spans, or whatever it is? Do you see any opportunities for future research from what you've done or what you're doing?
Absolutely. My work is by no means exhaustive. It is really meant to be foundational. It's meant to be kind of a jumping off point, and that's what I see it as. I personally know I'm not done with this topic, even as I complete my thesis and like everything that goes into that. I know that there's still so much more to be learned. I only worked on a select films from a handful of filmmakers, and there are dozens more who were active during that same time period. It's just that their works didn't quite fit the same theme. So, there's always more work to be done, and I completely welcome more research in this particular topic. I would love it if my work was a jumping point, but it doesn't have to be. Other people just interested in that same area can have their own takes on it. They can focus more on story rather than style. They can focus on different elements of style. I just really just want there to be a lot more attention given to this area, and I welcome all of that.
Wonderful. Have you had opportunities to disseminate your research, either in writing or orally, conferences, presentations? Have you had any opportunities like that since you started? And if you have, would you mind sharing some of those?
Sure. I On my specific research on the work that I've done, no, this is probably the first time I'm really talking about it. But before I started, I was part of the 3 Minute Thesis competition here at the University of Regina. That was really very early in my process, so I was really still figuring out what I wanted to do and why. And I really loved that experience because it really forced me to hone in on what exactly it is that I was researching. It was this robust process. I needed to, break down my entire thesis into a 3-minute talk. So really it made me focus on what the important ideas were, what the reasoning was and what I hoped to accomplish. And it really just helped me create this framework for how to approach my research. So yeah, that was a really wonderful experience.
Great. Are there any people throughout your journey in conducting academic research that have inspired you or that inspired you? I know you talked about the transition from psychology to film, but are there any specific individuals that have inspired you throughout this journey to get here that you want to talk about?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd say the very first one is actually also one of the main reasons that I was interested in this in the first place, is the filmmaker Kwaku Ayisi. He's one of the filmmakers whose works I'm looking at throughout in my research. And I really just he's someone that I found completely inspirational, even as I was working as an undergraduate in film. And when I lived back in Ghana after I completed my bachelor's, I went on a trip to the Bisabura Museum I believe it's in Takoradi, but I might be wrong on that. It might be on the Sekondi Takoradi border. But so I visited the Bisabura Museum, and it's this repository of African art and history, and it was so inspiring. There's just so much of our own history that is hidden from us, that we're just almost reluctant to look into because we're scared of the pain of colonialism and that legacy and what we're going to find out there. But what we're really doing is a disservice to ourselves. We're not looking into it. And as we were going through, the tour guide told us about the founder of the museum, who happened to be Kwaku Ayisi. And it was a really kind of amazing experience. I was like, wow, I'm in the domain of one of my idols, one of the people who inspired me to do what I'm doing. And it was a really wonderful experience. And what was even more amazing is that I went with my family, and my mother noticed an exhibition dedicated to a specific person who had always been excluded from Ghanaian history. And my mom was just really touched because this was her great-great-grandmother. And she was fascinated that there had never been any sort of any sort of information dedicated to how she helped revolutionize the education system in Ghana. And she was so touched that she asked if she could see the museum owner to thank him for including her great-great-grandmother. And it's just, there's all these crazy connections of fate because he was actually close friends with her. And we got to sit with him and have this wonderful long talk, just kind of reminiscing about the past and thinking of where we are currently and where we want to go in the future. So really, Kwaku Ayisi has been the primary of inspiration behind everything I'm doing. And I'm just really glad that we have such an important figure, in our culture, doing the work that he's doing. And just, never stopping, even though his filmmaking days are behind him, he's still making sure that our history is still accessible to us. It's really wonderful. I would also say that my supervisor at the University of Regina, Dr. Sheila Petty, has been a huge inspiration. She's been this great sounding board for, getting me kind of on the straight and narrow with my ideas. I came to her with wide, broad thoughts, and she encouraged me to keep kind of whittling down and pick a specific focus area that I was really passionate about. So she's been really instrumental in helping me get to the point where I'm really confident in what I'm doing, and it's something that I really am capable of taking on. Yeah.
Wonderful. Now, do you have or would you have any advice for anyone who is thinking or planning to do what you did in pursuing a master's degree, research-based master's degree, or even more specifically in film? If someone wanted to know or wanted some advice, what would you tell them?
I would say to persevere, to keep at it. The process can be very frustrating and difficult. Like I said, academia can also be a little bit inscrutable, a bit difficult to navigate if you don't come from a background that teaches you how everything is set up. So it can be a bit difficult to try to get your interests aligned with the structures of the academic world. It can be really tough to make sure that you're adhering to the standards and principles required while still making sure that your research is far-reaching and important and deep and significant to you and what you want to do. But it's so important to keep at it. It's important to stay focused and keep that passion alive, because that passion fuels you through a lot. So there have been times where I kind of wonder why I'm doing all this, and then I realize, no, this is something I truly care about. So even when I'm frustrated or the process is kind of wearing down on me, it's still something that I deeply care about, and I think it's something that's very important, and important to go through like the right channels to get out there. I mean, academia isn't the be-all, end-all of everything, but it does add a certain legitimacy to the work that you're doing. So I would just say, persevere. Persevere.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us today, Max. It's been wonderful having this discussion and learning more about Ghanaian film with you. So thank you.
Yeah, of course.
Thank you so much for tuning in to the Academic Research Made Simple podcast. Please tune in again as we discuss more incredible work being done by racialized graduate students and racialized faculty.